Good morning, everybody. It's Steve Brown from Mirae Asset Securities, Head of Institutional Sales for Vietnam. Joining us this morning, we have Mr. Simon White, who's the President of the Australia-Vietnam Business Council. He's the CEO of the Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce. He's also a consultant, strategist and board advisor to multiple companies and civic authorities and cities in Australia. On top of that, he's recently become a board advisor for the Australia-Vietnam Leadership Dialogue. That entity in Vietnam has some of the leading Viet Q from Australia involved, including Mr. David Do, one of the private equity leaders of Vietnam in recent years, with around about $500 million invested in Vietnamese companies. Also, Ms. Trang Bui, who's the Vietnam head of Cushman & Wakefield Real Estate. Simon, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve, and it's great to be here. So thank you to everybody for having me.
Very good. If we can firstly discuss, you've been the CEO of something as important as the Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce for around about 15 years in Queensland, Australia, and that's got over 1,200 members and also international affiliations. You've been a strategic consultant to mayors, including Tom Tate. You've been recently appointed to join the Australia-Vietnam Leadership Dialogue. You have a very high interest in Vietnam. You've been coming here since about 2010. Expand upon the rationale of your keen interest in Vietnam and where you see its place for foreign investors.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Look, when I first came here in around 2010, I actually had never been to Vietnam, and I actually had no desire to come to Vietnam before that, but I had family who had been coming here for many years and backpacking around, and had always persuaded me that I should be in Vietnam. And an opportunity arose to come up here and assist a major association across Australia, a membership association, who had planned to do a national conference in Vietnam. And I ended up coming up about 7 times in 12 months to set up an engagement for about 350 electricians that were coming up here for Australia. And sort of fell in love with the place. There was an energy here that was palatable. You could almost feel the energy in the streets with the people. And I was lucky enough on one of my trips to sit next to a New Zealand businessman who was looking to move some manufacturing capacity into Asia somehow due to the influences of the GFC on production costs. And he had come out of retirement and was a little bit, I guess, bamboozled by the whole concept of what do I do. And being an entrepreneur at heart, I sat next to him on a flight and I just said, look, that shouldn't be too hard, I can help you with that. And as a result, created a business interest that spanned Australia to Vietnam. So subsequently spent a number of years trying to convince Australian businesses that China wasn't the only place to do business in Asia, and there was some massive opportunity here. And in doing so, spent a lot of time trying to understand the culture, not just of business, but of the people of Vietnam as well, because that drives their understanding of how business should work.
So the Australia-Vietnam Business Council, we'll dive into that one first. Yes. Its mandate and some of its achievements of late.
Well, the Business Council in Queensland, where I'm the president, is reasonably new. The gentleman that actually started the New South Wales office 28 years ago retired to Queensland and said, look, we don't have a presence in Queensland, we need to do something. And I was lucky enough to be contacted through connections in Vietnam, actually expats in Vietnam, who said, look, you need to talk to Simon White, he'd be good to help out. And I was invited to become part of the board. And we have only just been incorporated actually, but we're already doing some great things. We're kicking some great goals in helping some Australian businesses and Australian government areas and government departments and cities understand and write policy about their Vietnam engagement.
And if we expand on that, as an expert on the Vietnam market, as a consultant and an expert advisor, in your previous visit, we had the privilege of interviewing Councillor Tom Tate, the Mayor of the Gold Coast, Australia. They are in a friendship agreement currently with Da Nang that will be expanding this year into a full sister city agreement with Da Nang. Two of Southeast Asia's leading tourism destination cities, Da Nang in Vietnam and Gold Coast, Australia. Now, where you're looking with your engagement with corporates now, FDI opportunities, FII opportunities for Australian, Israeli, and more broadly, global corporates looking to invest in Vietnam. Any specific sectors, any specific strategic locations for setting up? What's your advice for those style of companies?
Well, I think there's probably two major areas that I think are really important to us right at the moment for Australia, and Queensland, Gold Coast, Brisbane, but certainly across Australia. I think the first one would be the manufacturing sector, so supply chain, de-risking the supply chain, where predominantly that's been dominated by using factories or setting up factories in China. And as we see global move away from China as a partner due to geopolitical issues, we're seeing more demand coming into places like Vietnam. So a lot of people in Australia are looking towards Vietnam as an opportunity for investment into their own factories or into joint venture development with existing Vietnamese companies as supply chain. So in that regard, we're seeing the concept of retail supply chain becoming very important for major retailers. And we already see major retailers already up here with their garment manufacturing, plastics, metal fabrication, and those sorts of industries. And that's only looking to increase.
And the listed corporates now in Vietnam, on the flip side, you also consult as a market entry strategist for some of Vietnam's leading Ho Chi Minh Stock Exchange listed companies as well. In recent times, you've helped them set up their subsidiary office premises or factories or even mining operations in Australia. So one of those you've been in discussion with was Fat Group,
Yes.
HPG, one of the largest and most popular stocks in the steel sector for foreign investors and local Vietnamese share investors as well. Can you enlighten us a little bit? That's publicly available for us to discover how you go about that type of activity.
Sure. Well, look, firstly, those activities come to me. We're very lucky in Australia to have a Vietnamese ambassador that's come out of the foreign affairs, foreign trade area and been involved in setting up a lot of the trade agreements that are, between Vietnam and around the world. So he's very commercial in his approach, and Ambassador Tan is very good to work with. So he understands the importance of helping those Vietnamese companies. So quite often he will reach out to people in positions that I have or my counterparts in the AVBC around Australia and say, look, how can you help us in this company? So with Fat, for instance, they have a representative in, a Vietnamese representative living in Brisbane, and that person was introduced to me, and we've been helping with their acquisition of metallurgical coal for steel manufacturing here. And obviously there's high demand for metallurgical coal globally, but certainly Queensland's a major supply chain part of that from a global perspective. And they're looking at that supply chain. And I believe that will probably become, that office that they have there will become more important, not just in supply chain acquisition, but in actual trade and probably sales of Vietnamese steel manufacturing into Australia in the future.
Very good. Now, the other things that you're involved with, which is part of Vietnam's strategic thrust into the future, they're looking at, the cyber industry, the G5 development, also the high-tech industrial parks. There's a few of those are in Vietnam already. You're also with the Cybertech Institute in Australia.
Yes.
And where do you see the vision of that progressing in Vietnam and with Australia's engagement, Israeli or anyone else for that matter?
Well, I think the first thing is I don't think it matters how well protected you are. We've seen 3 major breaches in Australian listed companies in the last, a government department and 2 listed companies in Australia in the last 6 months. So I don't think it matters geographically where you are. But I think what we see in Vietnam is there's a high level of technically trained and competent people here from a point of view of looking at utilising technology, and that's great. That's fantastic. Where they're isn't in comparison to Australia are developmental frameworks that are mandated by government to ensure that cyber risk frameworks have been addressed by public companies here and addressed by private companies as well around protection of data and the concept of GDPR, which is legislated in the UK and the US and in Australia. So I think there's great opportunities internationally. From an Israel perspective, there's been a lot of activity between Israel and Vietnam historically. Ho Chi Minh City Smart Cities delegation went over just to COVID and spent some time in Israel. There's a proposed MOU that should be signed this year between Vietnam and Israel. And there's obviously the tech transfer of Vietnamese companies. So we're looking here at the manufacture of Samsung, Apple products, strain NBN routers that we receive are manufactured in Vietnam. And those devices need to be protected, and that protection comes from global companies. And I think it's worth mentioning that I think about 15 years ago in Vietnam, the top 100 companies here by revenue, around about 90% of them were government-owned corporations. And I think if you flip that to last year or the year before when there was a report, I think we're down to 7. So what that does is, that's the investment where government is now partnering with major global companies. And when global companies come into an economy, we see a shift in the need for framework development. And that's cyber. That results in the recent decree of the government to ensure data of Vietnamese citizens is held on shore, and therefore the rise of the concept of data centres within Vietnam.
For sure. I think Microsoft up near Da Nang recently announced they're going to build a mega data center up there, groundbreaking maybe even as early as this year. And then there are other corporates doing that as well. Now, where you've been in recent times with the property consultancy, construction consultancy, I had the privilege of attending meetings with Simon last year with construction companies from as far as Sydney, Australia, who are engaging now with listed Vietnamese construction companies and property developers with projects going on right here on the ground in Ho Chi Minh City. The potential for other Vietnamese companies in the construction space, do you see those style of engagements once the property scene cools down and settles down, the corporate bond market gets a bit of more clarity and transparency? Do you see a bit of a return appetite of interest coming from your network in Australia for the Vietnamese real estate scene as well?
Look, Steve, I think that's really, that's a really important market for Australian businesses. I think that the thing that we do very well in Australia, and it's also one of our downfalls, is we do the compliance regimes and the red tape really, really well. And Australia has some of the highest compliance and governance regimes across all industries in the world. And I think that at some stage, there's some of those things that experts can import into as services. And when that happens, it's going to be the major companies that drive that. So it's going to be the major planners and the major architectural developers, and it's going to be the urban planners and the smart cities people that start that. And when they start to come in, what happens is the large corporates, the large Australian corporates in the construction and development industry will follow. And we see that already with people like Multiplex and those sorts of people that are here. And we see that we see that desire to see Vietnam as a massive market. And I think when you look at the number of developments here that sit idle at the moment, and the ability for Australian companies to invest to regenerate those projects,
Sure,
are really important.
Yeah.
And I think the westernisation of the middle class in Vietnam and embracing that sort of concept of where they'd like to live and what they need and that connectivity of their home becomes really important. And of course we have those things.
And the uplift in education enfranchisement for the citizens, global citizen education opportunities coming into Vietnam, RMIT Vietnam, the Swinburne University now as well here. You're heavily engaged as a strategist and consultant advisor to bodies and institutions such as those. Do you see any potential there for other universities from, is Israel here in your engagement with the...
I don't think Israeli universities are here. They tend to go the other way. So they'll come to Vietnam and get the best and brightest and bring them back to Israel.
Take them for scholarships.
They take them for scholarships, yeah.
Right. So, okay.
But I think that the Israelis are here in the commercialization models.
Got it.
And there's been Australian recently, University of Queensland set up the innovation hub for the Vietnamese government in Hanoi through their UQ Ventures program, which is their innovation and commercialization hub.
Right. Okay. Yep. So in your view, the recent several-year phenomenon of Vietnamese going into Australia, there's been over 80,000 Vietnamese who've been through the university systems of Australia now, and now in the more recent years, we've got an influx of Australian universities coming, with Swinburne and to follow on from the RMIT Vietnam lead, and then District 3 Ho Chi Minh City, there's the Global Victoria Study Hub for everything from K-12 to all of the universities in Victoria on offer for the students of Vietnam to participate in getting a higher education as well.
Well, I think there's those opportunities. I think in Study Gold Coast was here last week that represents four global Australian universities in the Gold Coast region. And their statistics showed that the biggest number of international students in their campuses in the Gold Coast at the moment are actually coming out of South America. Traditionally, that would have been China, which is now second place. And I think that universities are looking to replace the Asian numbers that haven't been there. Conversely, I've been working with some of the universities between Australia and within Ho Chi Minh City around technical skills, because Australia has a massive shortage of technical skills at the moment in engineering and surveying and geospatial technologies, mining engineering. And of course, in Vietnam, we have this thirst for knowledge. So we have graduates saying, if I could work in Australia, in my capacity, in my profession, I could come back with a lot of practical knowledge to bring back into Vietnam. And I saw some figures only recently. I think it's 7.5 million overseas undergraduate students from Vietnam have returned Vietnamese students have returned in the last 3 years. So 7.5 million undergraduate internationally qualified young Vietnamese. So there's a move, I think, Australia's had an immigration policy or a visa policy, which has come down and do your study, do the skills transfer and go home. I think the skills policy within visas now for Australia is come down, do your study, excel and stay. Now that's not good for Vietnam, it's good for Australia, but it's good longer term, because what happens is students don't just say, now I've done my study, I don't have any Australian work experience. I don't have work experience in English language, within an English language speaking workplace. So when they come back to Vietnam, that minimises their, opportunity here. And the value of that knowledge transfer is only at an academic level, it's not at a practical level. And, to really benefit Vietnam and that person's career, and which, we really want to see people that come back after some work experience and then bring that sort of corporate expertise from large companies. And I think once you do that and you've got that alumni programs such as the universities and the Australian Vietnam Leadership Dialogue are working on, then those young professionals here will help the corporates come from Australia and invest in Vietnam.
For sure. And totally elevate the whole corporate environment, whether it be from corporate governance or business philosophy, strategy, and engagement in a globalized community sense. So our final questions for you today. The Australia-Vietnamese 50-year anniversary of diplomatic relations is being celebrated this year. Where do you see not the next 50 years going, but perhaps the next 3 to 5, or maybe the 10-year vision? And how do you see the perceptions among both communities, citizens?
Well, I think in the first instance, Australia is very focused on Vietnam as a partner, and I would think probably in the last 2 or 3 years that's exponentially higher than it has been in the previous 10. And I see the same thing within the Vietnamese companies and government here in their way they're engaging into Australia and the number of companies coming down to visit us in Australia. So I think it's Vietnam and Australia's time to shine. I don't profess I think I'll be around for the next 50th year anniversary, Steve, but I would like to see that in 10 years' time that the hard work that people like you and others here are doing and in Australia really starts to to sort of breed something from this stage it's at. I'd say that if we did it in terms of our children, you know, we've now, it might be a 50-year relationship, but we've really got a 10-year-old, and we've got to go through some of those terrible teen years to fully understand each other. And you probably would have seen that the two governments have set up the Vietnam Australia Centre in Hanoi, which has been set up to improve corporate relations and better understanding of how to do business in each country. So that's a really big step. I mean, that's $25 million from each government. So that's a big investment. I think when we get to perceptions, you know, I've always felt that Australian business struggles to understand Vietnam as a market. People see Vietnam as a fantastic, you know, food and holiday destination. If anyone asks me what the best thing about Vietnam is, I'll say the food, and I'll follow that with the people. I don't think when you talk to Australian business people or within Australian communities, they fully yet understand what Vietnam has to offer from a business or trade perspective or an investment perspective. But the focus of many Australian and state government leaders that have been, and city or civic leaders that have been coming to Vietnam post-COVID in the last 12 months is an indication of where that's going.
There's been a tremendous amount.
There's been lots and lots of, and every day we will see in social media feeds and media feeds somebody else who's here and somebody from Vietnam who, in a corporate sense or in a government sense, is in Vietnam.
Sure, and you've been very, very much on the front foot in enabling the listed corporates of Vietnam to start to penetrate into Australia, whether it be for supply chain, like you noted with Phát for vertical integration of consistent supply of high quality coal for what they're after for their steel industry, or for any other of the Vietnamese companies that you've been dealing with wanting to set up operations in Australia, Sydney and Brisbane, for instance, in recent months for some other listed companies. Simon White, thank you very much for being on Mirae Asset Securities. And I know you've got a very busy schedule. You've got another delegation coming in the next several weeks to Vietnam. So wish you every success for that. And it's a very cathartic thing you must be doing, and a very uplifting thing you must be doing to see over the last 10 years, well, since 2010, that you've been coming here to see the massive progression of Vietnam and Australian engagement at the corporate sense, and also at the cultural and educational sense as well.
I think, Steve, the other thing that's really good is to see the development of the Vietnamese people as a result of that, and the embracing of, people ask me what it's like as an Australian when you come to Vietnam, and people are just, the people are just so nice and friendly all the time, and welcoming and ready to help with a smile on their face. And that's not, in other economies, it's not always like that. So yes, that's really important.
Yes, and the GDP per capita is going up. They can travel to Australia now. They can fly Vietjet, Bamboo Airways and Vietnam Airlines direct to Australia, as Mayor Tom Tate will be hoping to see an influx of Vietnamese airlines coming to Gold Coast International.
Well, we'll say, in Gold Coast words, what better classroom could you have if you were studying anywhere in the world than the Gold Coast? I mean, it's a magical place, and when you show photos of the Gold Coast to Vietnamese people, they think you're showing them something you've airbrushed.
And rapidly start to forget about Melbourne or somewhere else.
We can only hope.
Yeah.
No, but there's a weather issue as well, and the weather is very similar. And
beautiful city. Beautiful.
But so, Steve, thanks very much for having me on today, and it's been a pleasure, and your support has also always been a pleasure for me and the people I bring up here to take the time to help educate us on the Vietnamese market. So that's fantastic as well.
Mirae Asset Securities, honour and privilege, Simon.
Thank you.
Steve Brown from Mirae Asset Securities, have a good morning.